So I wanted to do a little bit of a review of how I did the Nest Labs interview a few weeks ago, and how this demonstrates something that I do with Knovigator, which is be very efficient with my content. And this is something that Knovigator enables you to do. So Knovigator is a kind of my home base for wielding knowledge, for capturing content, writing down my ideas, and then slicing and dicing everything into cards that you can then manipulate, and then reach into all the various different threads in Navigator, pull together those pieces, those cards that are relevant, and synthesizing something new that can then be published to an audience in different platforms. It can be published to Navigator as well, but it can also easily be published to Twitter right now via very tight Twitter integration. You can export threads as documents, and then which is what I did when I answered Amlore in Nest Labs, and I synthesized a document that goes out to an email. And so I wanted to go over that process and explain how it works. And what I'll do is I'll show how I imported the initial email into a Navigator thread, how I could then use the branching to create separate spaces for to answer each question, how I reused my prior work very easily, and how I then published out to all of these different platforms. And finally, I'll talk about something called I call thread engineering, which is how you can use Navigator to, when you publish out to Twitter, create these branching structures in Twitter that your readers can explore. Okay, so first I wanted to talk about how I actually imported the interview questions that Anne-Laure from Nest Labs sent me into Navigator. And so the way that I do that is if I have paragraph 1 and paragraph 2, but pretend this is a longer piece of text with new lines between the paragraphs. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to start creating a new thread. The way I start creating a new thread is anytime I want to create a new one, I hit the stream logo of I just press the stream logo of whatever stream I'm in. That puts me at the top of the stream, in this case, the all stream. And I can paste that text into the writing prompt. And when I do that and hit start or enter to create the thread, Navigator is smart enough to realize that there's new lines in between pieces of text in that longer piece of text, and it creates a thread for me. And now it's a thread, and I can branch off of each of the messages. And this is exactly what I did with the email that I got when Nest Labs emailed me the questions. And now I can, so let me just jump into that email, Nest Labs interview. So I think this is the one I want right here. So I just clicked on the title, and that made this the active thread. And you can see that each of the messages in this thread has a question in it. And the reason I wanted to bring this into Navigator is because now when I click on the question, I get a brand new thread branching off of that question, which treats that question as the title of the thread. And so that creates for each of the questions, that creates a separate thread for me to work in, like a workspace to answer this question. And I can go ahead and actually isolate that question into it by making this the active thread. And now I have a space for me to work in and answer this question. Okay, so I wanted to go over kind of the workflow and drafting process that I use to answer these questions. So just to recap, let's hop back into the interview. Here it is. So we have an interview here. I imported the questions from an email with each message now being a question. When I click on that question, that opens up, that branches off a thread in which I actually answer that question. I can go ahead and make that the active thread to focus in on my work. And here's where I actually answered it. But since I've already done this work, let me kind of recreate as a demo So for example, let's pretend that we have an interview here. And we have question 1, question 2. So each of these questions then gets its own thread to work on an answer in. And maybe I'm like writing here. But what I would do is I would actually create a message here as like a scratch pad. So maybe it would be question 1, scratch pad. And I would branch off another thread, or maybe it's called brainstorm. And this would be like where I collect all of the different resources that might inspire me, or questions that I might reuse. So let's pretend this is actually like, what is Knovigator? And then what I could do is I could just search. I hit the search button, or I could edit, or I could edit here. And now I'm searching and basically curating prior work that might inform my answer. So this looks interesting. So I'm just hitting the quote button here to pick out the best automatically researched conversation in emergent knowledge base. And so now when I go back to my thread, this is like my scratch pad, if you recall. Now I have all of these resources that I can use to inform my answer. So just to continue, so if we go back to our Knovigator Scratchpad, to review, we had, I'm using this thread to pretending like this is the interview. So interview question 1, question 2. Now I'm working on answering question 1, and this is where I would be working. But here I created another branch that's a scratch pad. So this is like, so this is my final answer. This is where I would, this is the thread that represents my final answer, but I kind of have a staging area here branching off. And this is where I'm doing my research. So I ended up searching for what is Knovigator. I pulled in these messages, and I can just kind of like start filling out. So maybe I'm using this as an inspiration, and I can actually throw in a new message and start writing here like Knovigator is great. And I'm kind of writing based off of what I've found in this quoted thread. So I kind of have a reference that's inspiring me and inspiring content. And maybe I pull this up. Oops. And now I want to throw in some more. Maybe this would be like, working with the machine is important. So the idea I'm trying to illustrate here is that I have a branch open here, and I'm kind of using that to inspire my writing here, and then maybe I do some synthesis, and final. And when I'm done doing that, more good stuff. When I'm done doing that, I just follow back up the tree, and this is my final answer thread, and I can go ahead, whoops, excuse me, I can go ahead and just drag and drop these and edit them if I want, change the order, whatever it is, add more content. So let's go over one more time. So I have this review. Sorry, I have this question, and I'm answering it in its own thread. But this is the final answer, and the form it takes is actually in the form of a thread tree. So the final kind of published product here was an export to a blog article, so it was all single dimensional. But when I composed it, I actually composed it as a thread, which answers this question. And there's some messages in here that branch off into their own sections, which were kind of flattened out into the blog post. But in Knovigator, they're actually, you can see that this section has its own thread. And so there's 24 messages, 19 messages. So this is in a tree structure representing my thinking on as part of an answer to this question. And the cool thing about this is that I can take each of these kind of sub threads and I can tweet them out through the Twitter integration. I can tweet them to any number of accounts and broadcast this content to my audience. So I'm reusing this content. This content was was the basis for the answer in the blog post, but I can also just effortlessly tweet it out to these accounts. And if I follow this out, you can see this is the thread, including the video, which got exported. And the same thing with the other sections as well. They each comprise, so each of these sections as well was tweeted out. You can see here. But the cool thing about that is that I can actually tweet it out. Having tweeted these out, I then tweeted out the parent. So you can see this is a tweet, this is a tweet, this is a tweet. And because these were already tweeted out, Knovigator is smart enough to quote tweet these. And I'll show you that in the next video of what that does. Okay, so finally, I wanted to show what was the actual, so how I actually recreated this threaded branching structure in Twitter. And what I'm talking about is this thread. And this is the original Knovigator thread that was published out to Twitter. So what I actually did is I created a what is Knovigator thread, and then I quoted in these messages from my answer to Anne Lore. And you can see I didn't want to tweet this entire thread, including the question. I wanted it to be a standalone thing, and I didn't want to, for example, tweet this message. So what I ended up doing is I ended up quoting this. So you can see that these actually match up. So I created this what is Knovigator thread. Then I quoted this message. So this is the same. I quoted this, and I quoted these two are the same. And I ended up so I did that for all of these messages. And then I ended up, you can see that then we go into infinite threading. And when I quoted this infinite threading message, I had already tweeted out, you can see infinite threading is tweeted out. And because I quoted it in Knovigator, Knovigator is smart enough to realize that this message is already in Twitter, and it will actually quote this message in Twitter. So what I mean is these messages, when I quoted them, they hadn't been tweeted yet. So Knovigator tweeted them out as kind of standalone messages. But the infinite threading and integrated writing search, BSV, all of these, they had already been tweeted out, and Knovigator is smart enough to include these as quote tweets, which then go into a branch similar to how Knovigator works, but recreated in Twitter. And this is what I call thread engineering. So I just wanted to spend a little bit more time just going over what is actually happening in Twitter. So this was built using, published out using a Knovigator thread that then publishes, broadcasts to Twitter, and mirrors that content, as I talked about in the previous video. So here we just have a thread, but then I quote tweet the head of the next thread. So you can see, so going back. So each of these actually represents a branch, just exactly as you see in Knovigator. So for example, in Knovigator, if I go to, let's go here. So if I actually go to infinite threading, here we go. And so infinite threading has a parent. So this is the structure I'm trying to recreate. So I'm trying to recreate this thread, and then each of these has this 24, 19, 13. And so you can see how Navigator makes this easy to see. But in Twitter, this doesn't quite look as good because you actually have to, it actually takes you to the infinite threading thread. It doesn't happen side by side, but it's the same idea. So this actually is a portal to a branch that I can then look at just in the same way that this is a portal to this branch. And I can just scroll this.